So in the next section, we're going to go on to your big ideas in terms of the academic contributions you've made to the Academy of Educational Research and Psychological Research, and also learning sciences. So your research and scholarship has had a significant national and international impact, particularly in learning and development, scientific understanding in children, socially shared cognition, and the like. We're going to start about learning in and outside of school first. So tell us about, if you recall, the address you gave when you were the president.
I had a reason to reread that in the last few months because I thought it would be filled with things to help me with my next big project. It was not, but it was an interesting paper.
Fun to revisit it.
What? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was just at the time that the Vygotskian stuff was out and about. And when various people, not so much psychologists, but some, were looking at how learning was happening in all the places but school. So that's what the out referred to. It wasn't after school or special programs or any of that. It was how did people learn how to navigate ships into the San Diego harbor. That was a major anthropologist who was studying ship. Think about studying ship navigation as an anthropologist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out that no one person on the ship actually knew where the ship was at any moment. The captain was the receiving point for information on the ship's location coming from, I can't remember exactly, I think 6 separate points. But, so you might say that the captain knew, but the captain never saw any basic data. The captain was getting refined data from 6 different people who had access to only a little bit of data. That's why they had time to refine it. And so they managed to bring big ships into dock in the San Diego harbor, which is filled with places where those ships could go astray and have the bottom knocked out. That was one of the in school and out ones. There were a string of others, which I'm sure if you've read it, you know what they were, maybe better than I do. One of them was similar case, actually, bringing planes from wherever they first touched base in the San Jose airport into their dock where passengers could get off. It's a similar thing, really, because you're bringing the plane in through a place where there's a lot of other activity. And the way that the San Diego airport had worked it out, which apparently was how it was done elsewhere, was to have different people tracking the plane from different points of view.
Okay.
Different cameras, actually. I think it had to be cameras. Mm-hmm. And then putting their data together. Well, one of the stories about, and they never had a plane bump into each other. They never had planes bump into each other. So this system was working. Turned out that one of the reasons it was thought it was working was that the people in the not the towers, but wherever they were guiding the planes in from, the towers would guide them onto the ground, and then there were ground stations that would guide them in from wherever they landed to their
ports.
Base, their ports. There was a rule that, and they were doing this all on TV screens. There was a rule that you weren't ever supposed to turn around and face each other. But the people in those who were doing this guidance just decided that that was crazy, that they really should face each other, and as they were reading their own data, be able to talk about it immediately with people who were looking at other relevant data for the same plane. And so they just turned their computers around. Somehow it didn't get blocked. It was breaking the rules. A lot of these first things that where we learned how to do shared cognition, broke one rule or another. They let this go on in at least one place, and never challenged it. So it was possible for Lucy, I forget her name, an anthropologist, to figure out what was going on, how that was working. And so they were combining technical information coming from the electronic system of the plane, things that the pilot was saying, and the way it looked from different angles. And they were doing that in a way that they could share data, and they never had a crash. So I don't know whether the rules were changed or not, but they never interrupted, as far as I know, the groups that had turned their computers around.
So this was the foundation for this AERA presidential
address.
address.
And I went through a whole bunch of them that were known if you looked outside standard psychology.
Sure.
Psychologists were involved, but they weren't the leaders in this work.
Okay.
And then I spoke about it. And everything's timing in life. That would have been in 1987. And I think the translation of Vygotsky that took off was published in 1978. So, it just was taking that much time.
Sure.
That meant we had a theory for what was going on.
Sure.
Which we wouldn't have had 10 years earlier. And and maybe the research wouldn't have been being done 10 years earlier.
Sure.
So, what was your question?
So
I've lost it.
what were the implications that you drew in terms of this?
Well,
this
the implications
education?
were that what we were doing in school had isolated school from the realities of the ways in which high intellectual and high things with really big impact on the world, like two planes bumping into each other and both of them blowing up or something like that, that those things were not being done by one person who is filling out a book and doing a procedure the way school is mostly organized, still is. That was the implication. What I expected to find when I went back to read it was that implication was developed into some new ways of doing schooling, but it wasn't. It was simply a recognition that the way we did it in school wasn't the only way to learn. And I remember Bob Glazer saying, "So, Lauren, what's your conclusion from all this?" What did he say exactly? It was very funny. Is your conclusion that everybody should go out and get on a computer screen? I really don't remember.
Right.
But it didn't seem to have a direct impact for education. But it was one of the most highly cited education papers for the next 10 or 15 years. So clearly its time had come. And I just brought it all together. Al Shanker picked it up, wrote an op-ed piece on it. That led to another more well-known op-ed person doing an op-ed on it. And that got published in Britain. And that led to a phone call that I got early one morning from a man speaking with a heavy Scottish accent. He said, I can't copy the accent, but it was really very much part of the event.
Oh, do try.
No, yeah. He said, "I want to bring my boyos to you for a week." What? Your boyos? Who are your boyos, and why would you want to bring them to me for a week? He was the coach, what do you call the adult head of a scout troop, and this was for one of those advanced scout troops.
Scout leader.
Scout leader, and that was a troop that was specializing in navigation.
Oh.
So from Al Shanker to this other op-ed writer, which got it published in Britain, to this head of a troop in Scotland was quite a voyage. And I told him that I really didn't think that I was the person who could teach his boyos very much, but I sent him off to, I have to remember the name, an anthropologist who had done the work.
Done the work, right.
Yeah, and he was sitting, not having gotten a good academic position yet, working in the office of, not the Office of Naval Research, but the major, in an office in the San Diego Department of the Navy. Mm-hmm. And he had money to do what he needed to do. The only thing was it had to have some utility, possibly, to the Navy. And that's how he got the idea of studying different systems of navigation. And it was the one coming into the San Diego harbor. He did a number of others. He looked at navigation from the South Sea Islands or something like that to South America. He was a sailor himself as a hobby, and he was a great colleague, full of humor about all this. He eventually won one of those awards from the foundation in Chicago that funds a lot of.
For his work,
yeah,
his anthropological work on this particular science.
So I think he went. I think he took his boyos out to spend a week with Ed, and it probably went very well. I think he probably wrote me a note, but I don't really remember it very well.
Well, this piece was published in Educational Researcher, I believe, as well, as your address, your presidential address. Your colleague and friend, Dr. Charles Perfetti, I believe that's how you say his last name, cited this 1987 AERA presidential address as reflective of one of your many contributions to scholarship, during which you analyzed how learning in the everyday world and learning in schools are systematically different in fundamental ways, and how these differences lead to schooling that is less effective for broader societal, economic, and civil goals. So taking this now, where are we 30 years later, what are implications of this research in terms of what can we still take up as educational researchers and also educators?
Say it again. What did he say? And what you just read?
Let's see. That basically that you analyze the extent to which learning in the everyday world and learning in schools are systematically different in fundamental ways. And so how can we take what you learned in that research that you addressed to today?
I mean, there are a collection of things that I think may not fully come together yet. One is that learning out of school is rarely done privately. There are times when somebody will take up the manual and get ready for a group meeting.
Sure.
But most of the important learning and development of new ideas, so it's not just me learning what somebody else has developed, but us together developing the next idea. Much of that is done socially. And the first thing you have to think about is how you would capture that socialization, social process in school. It's very badly captured. And I can come back to that. So, but that's one part. A second is that ritualized answer. There's some ritual involved. There are politeness rules and joking around rules, all kinds of things that aren't the intellectual heartland. But the intellectual heartland is pretty astounding. We can show evidence now of, say, 9-year-olds arguing about some mathematical problem. Mm-hmm. And if they've gotten the right kind of support, this is hardly always, their argumentation is on a par with good philosophical reasoning. That is, they understand that you have to prove something. They understand if-then contingencies. They understand that if you're right, I could be right too, or maybe in another situation, if you're right, then I can't be. So we should figure out together which it is. Kids know how to do all of this. Mm-hmm. The ways in which they do it becomes more and more formalized and logical. But here's an example. It's taken from the research of Rochelle Gelman, who had a student who was in the era when a lot of us were trying to understand the development of children's intuitions about mathematics. This student and Rochelle got interested in understanding of infinity. What was the biggest number in the world was the problem they were posing to children in a fairly typical developmental psychology interview. And over about 4 months, so really not enough time for a whole new stage to click in the Piagetian sense. But they were doing interviews sort of like the Piagetian ones. But over time in the classrooms, or one classroom, I forget, that they were studying, more and more kids said, there isn't any largest number. You can always add one more. Mm. And only a few were saying that in, let's say, February, but almost everybody was saying it in May. And nobody had taught it. The teacher didn't know anything about this.
Okay.
Because this was, I think, maybe a third grade classroom. I don't remember what. You can look it up. So getting this surprising result, where something not being taught is improving dramatically over 3 months, when most math abilities don't improve dramatically even over a year. The investigators went to talk to the teacher about what's happening. And the teacher said, I don't really know. I just know that when you take the kids out, they come back excited. And I know that they're talking about this on the playground. What's the biggest number in the world? They're having arguments about it. And that must be what is doing that. So then they did, whether it was built into the initial study or didn't, or was a second study, I can't remember this minute. We could look it up. It's a well-known study. It's been republished, I think, a couple of times. It turned out that when the kids knew how to count reliably to 110, then they knew that you could always add one more. It wasn't enough to be able to count just to 100, because at first when kids get to 100, they think it stops there. And it takes a while to get to 101. And they learn it from each other.
Sure.
And once they're getting to 101, they get to 102 and on up. And they know, once they know how to count to 10, they learn about 11. So they know if you get to 2010, you can do 2011. This is a wonderful, remarkable invention, partly a social invention. It must be social even when Gelman and student aren't around, because how else? Somebody has to tell you that after 10 comes 11. It doesn't, especially if you're an English speaker, it's not a very good counting system. There are other counting systems where 11 is let me think about French. No, French isn't good either. It goes from 10 to 11, and it takes a while before the 10s are renamed. So I forget which languages do it. But so for English and French, anyway, it takes a while for kids to realize that 11 is really just 10 plus 1. And then they get to 20 and they realize, because they're chattering with each other, that there is a number after 20 and it's 21. And from then on, it's all regular. Not in French, by the way. 71 doesn't lead to 81.
Okay.
But in English it does. And the French learned to do this as well. They just probably takes a few weeks longer. So you get this, when these things start showing up, when there are people rerunning the Piaget studies who are not Piagetians really, but they know Piaget is onto something really deep, ask themselves, how could a kid who knows that this many objects is some number that they can count, and they're reliable about that, and now they're asked, I'm going to spread them out, are they the same number? The kids will say no. And that there is a stage when that's what happens. They say no. Look, it takes more space, so it has to be more. And then some linguists who do sociolinguistics, so they're thinking about how the social aspects of talk work, pointed out that people usually don't ask each other the same question twice unless they either didn't hear it,
right,
or they think they got the wrong answer. Now, if the kid thinks they got the wrong answer, I mean, if the kid thinks that the adult didn't hear it, they will say that. Didn't you hear me? But that wasn't the most interesting case. If the kids think that they got the wrong answer, they're going to give you a different answer, because the rules of how we talk to each other say you don't ask the same question twice unless there was a wrong answer somewhere in there. So that would lead to a period of a few months in which kids seem not to believe in the conservation of number under the change in displays, because they don't think that they would be asked the question a second time. So they have to change it. They have to change their answer to be right.
Okay.
Things like, studies like that were popping up. I've been collecting those studies now because I'm writing a book with one of the brilliant teachers I've worked with over the years, and we're trying to collect not just her great stories, but other people's great stories about how how kids know things that the teachers don't know they know. So the teachers are just looking for their following the next instruction.
Sure.
So we now know a lot about this, and that allows the sociolinguistics to come in as a major piece of educational knowledge. But it doesn't always fit with what educators know or what teachers know. So so that story with the counting, the tens, is a linguistics story. It's not a story about math. It's a story about language. And you start combining understanding of how language works with understanding of whatever it is you're trying to teach. And suddenly this whole new world opens up. And it's not closing yet. We're still in the midst of it. But it's very hard for working teachers because they're not, the psychology or linguistics, whichever they got most of, that they're getting is textbook stuff.
Right.
And they don't get to watch children struggling with these things. They don't get the chance to try it out by arguing with each other. It's all packaged in the kind of professional especially pre-service professional training that our students get, but also post, and that's a whole new thing that's going on now, tends to.
So in this same piece, you say that you wrote that schools are too isolated from everyday ways of using
Right.
the written word to serve as the only source of literacy competence in society. So, and that speaks exactly to what you're talking about right now. So how do we open up those spaces, particularly in the training of teachers to, and I know you've done a lot of work with practitioners, an extreme amount of work actually working
Yes.
directly with practitioners. How do we open up those spaces?
Well, I can tell you that what I think we have to do, but it's a reaction to minimal success over the past 10 years. Minimal success with really good people doing the training. Some of the ones who are out and about doing lectures for or publishing books
Sure.
for National Council for Teaching of Mathematics. I mean, these are
Fabulous
real stars.
teachers, right?
These are fabulous teachers doing the training, and they do the right kind of teaching, but there are only a few of them. And here's what we've gathered in the book that I referred to earlier. We went around collecting every piece of evidence that we could find at the time. That was about 5 years ago, so there's more evidence today, that there was transfer, what we call far transfer in psychology, meaning to another subject matter from certain ways of teaching over time. Transfer up to 3 years later to a subject matter distant from the one in which the teaching took place. We were able to find about between 10 and 12 studies, depending on what criterion of successful transfer you want to use, that showed this kind of thing. Amazing. Some people in London worked with volunteer science teachers of 12-year-olds using what I would call an accountable talk method. It's been called multiple things, but it involves engaging the kids in arguing about different situations involving scientific problems.
Processes, yeah.
Yeah. And much of it was hands-on, so they had something to argue about. And those kids were doing very noticeably better on the British National Reading Literacy examinations 3 years later. No chance that the scholars or the teachers in the study could have controlled those exams.
Okay.
It was a national exam. A Scottish group made up a somewhat enlarged version of Philosophy for Children, which is an American-developed attempt to teach elementary school kids major ideas in philosophy, ideas about proof, ideas about ethics, etc. And they somewhat modified it for what they thought would work better in their country. Good name is going away from me.
That's okay.
Scotland.
Yeah, sure.
And it worked, and it produced transfer. It produced transfer to an IQ test form that's nonverbal. So it couldn't have been that they were just learning talk ways. So they actually were getting higher IQ test scores. And we found about 10 of those with different subject matters to start and different transfer to subject matters. And it seemed like, knowing that and knowing what the actual talk was like, it was very similar in all these different people who weren't much in touch with each other. They were doing it separately. that there must be something that's common across these, because this is what education has been after for centuries. Transfer, serious transfer, and we were getting it, and it was always involving a form of talk. Started to work with the linguists, and that led to pretty strong hypotheses about what forms of talk, and some studies that showed the same kinds of transfer. Kids were creaming the Massachusetts English exams after being taught math through a method of, these were, I think, third graders, very low income kids, taught math through a sort of structured debate. Now that's a guided argument method. And those kids, that one teacher had invented, as had my teacher, Vic Bill, here in Pittsburgh. And in both cases, the kids were creaming English tests. And Vic's was exciting enough, but the one in New England was much more exciting because the kids were creaming the nation's most demanding English language test, the Massachusetts test. These are unbelievable. And there are more of them. We get, a dribble in of a new study. But as we pulled it all together in that conference and collecting some new data, bringing some new people in who just weren't people we knew about at the time we ran the conference, it turned out that that there was big resistance to doing this kind of teaching with any but the most upscale kids. So what you have, that we can show in some graphs, but they're a little hard to understand, so, is something that I'm a pretty big skeptic, but I think we know that this works. But we also know that most educators cannot or will not use it. And that's the new frontier. We have to figure out how to bring them into this when it conflicts with their view of what a teacher does and with their view of who's smart enough among the kids to do it. That's the new agenda. I don't have a solution yet, but that's what some of us are working on.
So changing the frameworks with which teachers approach their students.
Yeah. They have to be able to listen to the students. And that's scary in a classroom for a new young teacher. They don't really know how to do it. The methods that are used to give them feedback, some of the training they get is actually very good. Well grounded in what the research says. And in the best cases, offered not by scholars, but by really good teachers to each other.
Sure.
So it does not appear that even very good talk methods of teaching will do it. Will get them to risk or even recognize the opportunities. So now we're looking for other ones. The convergence, I think, but not everybody agrees, is to set the teachers up to analyze their own work. And that means that they make videos of themselves and they code their moves with the kids, or at least name them somehow. I don't know if we have to call it coding. They pick out what they did and didn't do, but that they could have done. And they have a coach who helps them in that process, but is not the deliverer of the judgment of whether they did well or not. We're trying to get the teachers to see it themselves. I don't have a success story to tell yet. For that. But
that's
I just got a note this morning from Vicki Bill that she got a grant to work on that, so we know we're going to get at least one study
So this
like
is
that
it's
done.
how to support them in terms of their own self-reflection,
Yep.
increasing accountable talk, and also socially shared construction.
Well,
And
the accountable talk
accountable
implies
talk.
socially
Okay.
shared
Okay.
construction.